Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon to you all. It's a great honour to be with you today, and I share a lot of the optimism from some of the other panellists, and I share a lot of the optimism about this year's climate negotiations with the other panellists. However, there are still a lot of thorny issues to be resolved, and I think the focus on climate finance especially is a very important one. So, as the British government prepares for a referendum on our membership of the EU, some people are making the case for why we should stay in the EU and why the UK matters for Europe. And I think climate diplomacy is one of those issues. And the UK has been very active, both trying to increase ambition in the EU, but also with our partners in Latin America and the Caribbean. And I think this is very important because it demonstrates the significance of Latin America as a key player in global climate governance. And it's very exciting to see how active both the UK and our partners in the EU have been engaging with the region. It's worth mentioning the work of the informal group, the Cartagena Dialogue at the UN climate talks. This is an informal dialogue made up of countries from Latin America and the Caribbean, European countries, Asia, Africa, amongst others. And it was created in 2010. And essentially, it's an informal space open to countries working towards an ambitious, comprehensive and legally binding regime and committed domestically to becoming or remaining low-carbon economies. And according to both officials from Latin America and the Caribbean, but also Europe, the Cartagena Dialogue has had a significant role, especially in Mexico, 2010, COP16, and in Durban in 2011 at COP17. However, recently, the dialogue seems to have kind of lost momentum. So for the next few minutes, I'm just going to discuss why the EU-CELAC summit matters for the UN climate talks by highlighting some of the favourable political conditions between both regions and areas of convergence between the EU and CELAC, Community of Latin American and Caribbean States. Along the way, if there's time, I'm just going to talk briefly about why Latin America is a key actor and a significant partner for the EU at the UN climate talks and in the pursuit of building a low-carbon and resilient global economy. So I'm just going to talk succinctly about some of these actions in the region, but also the latest round of pledges which are going to be published this year called the INDCs, the Intended Nationally Determined Contributions. And then I'm going to come back to the EU-CELAC context if I have time. So we all know next week the EU-CELAC summit in Brussels is a key meeting on the road to Paris to create a new climate agreement. Efforts by the EU and CELAC, I think, have demonstrated how it's the world's strongest bi-regional partnership on climate change. And two particular elements of this kind of like-minded thinking between both regions is the fact they've both declared their commitment to holding the rise in global temperature to below 2 degrees Celsius and to achieving legally binding outcomes in Paris, which, as we've heard, are not that palatable to other countries, namely the US. So I think we can see that the EU and CELAC heads of state can and should forge a close alliance and capitalise on these favourable political conditions between both regions to advance a progressive climate agenda, one that mandates their negotiators to push for a fair, equitable and ambitious agreement in December. We can see that climate impacts are already hitting Europe and Latin America hard, and they're causing severe economic damages and wreak havoc on vulnerable communities. So given the soaring climate-related economic costs in both Latin America and CELAC countries, both sides have much to gain and, more importantly, save from a global regime that significantly reduces emissions and strengthens resilience to climate risks. However, despite this progress between Europe and Latin America and the Caribbean on their cooperation, climate diplomacy, EU-CELAC relations have a long way to go before climate change is mainstreamed. And we can see, if we just take a look at the scale of EU-LAC trade and investment in heavily polluting and carbon-intensive sectors, this represents a key challenge. So the EU-LAC countries need to focus on these carbon-intensive sectors and try and limit the potential risks from a new climate agreement by encouraging their firms to actively invest in renewable energy environmental protection. On a more positive note, there's clearly a sense of purpose reflected by EU and LAC climate actions. As we heard from Monsieur Spencer, the EU is offering the strongest pledge yet for the Paris Agreement, and Latin American Caribbean countries are also taking a number of actions. I'll just mention one. I'm sure many of you know that Mexico created a climate change law in 2012 with targets to reduce emissions by 30% by 2020 below business as usual, and by 50% by 2050. Brazil really deserves a big mention given its remarkable efforts to reduce deforestation in the Amazon. And since 2004, it's brought deforestation down by 70% and its total national emissions by 30%, which is astounding. But deforestation is starting to kind of creep up again. So how long-term are these reductions? So this year, Latin American countries have to put forward their INDCs as part of the Paris climate deal. And I think we can see that the INDCs are really can be considered a strategic tool to set countries on a cleaner path toward low-carbon sustainable development while building resilience to climate impacts. And we can see that although Latin American countries play a modest role in the global carbon cycle, representing about 9.5% of global carbon emissions, they can send a valuable political signal by designing ambitious INDCs, which can put pressure on major emitters to take greater action. But the process by which countries are actually organising their INDCs is not really clear. It's an ongoing process. The countries have till October to present them. Mexico was the first developing country to announce its INDC at the end of March, and just to say briefly, it announced the intention for their emissions to peak by 2026 and made an unconditional target to reduce 25% of its greenhouse gas emissions and short-lived climate pollutant emissions, such as soot, below business as usual projections for 2030. Brazil is still working on its INDC. There's been some mutterings that it's going to be presented soon, but it's not really clear how ambitious it's going to be. Given the crises in Brazil at the moment, climate change doesn't really seem to be very high on President Dilma Rousseff's agenda. But we have to concede that Brazil has made these remarkable reductions in deforestation, but the low-hanging fruit from those reductions has been consumed, as it were. And I think looking forward, Brazil's contribution really needs to be focusing on the expansion of renewable energy and ensuring that this kind of carbonization of its energy systems with these increasing investments in fossil fuel are kind of brought down, and the focus on renewable energy is increased, and also ensuring that urban sustainable transport options are prioritized, as anyone who spent time in Sao Paulo could testify about the congestion. So moving on, the INDC process is underway, but there's a very important opportunity to improve civil society and business participation in climate change policy making. So essentially what governments need to do as they're putting together their INDCs, they need to engage with civil society, academia, citizens at large. And I think there's an opportunity here which suggests that inclusive and open climate policy making can increase domestic ownership over the climate agenda, which thus far has been very much kind of in a silo, locked up in the UN negotiations. And no one back home really knows what their countries are doing, how they put together their positions, and essentially citizens are disengaged. But the irony is that Latin American citizens, and indeed those in Europe, are very concerned about global warming, and they want to reduce air pollution. So governments really do have a mandate to push for ambitious INDCs, which bring together climate and development goals. So if we take something like air pollution in Santiago de Chile, if you brought down air pollution, obviously health-related factors would be decreased, but you're also reducing one of the most rapidly increasing sources of emissions in Latin America, which are from transport. So there's definitely some co-benefits that can be considered. Just to complement what David Wilk said, Latin American governments, as they put together their INDCs, should really sit down with the multilateral development banks to showcase what they plan to do, both their conditional and unconditional offers for their INDCs, to try and encourage investment, cooperation, and mobilize special credit lines. Presidential support for public consultations on the INDCs, and indeed their design generally, is essential. And one of the reasons why the INDC process in Chile has really advanced quite well, it had a public consultation which was mandated by President Michelle Bachelet, and this really helped to kind of increase the salience of the INDC process and kind of put it out there so citizens can engage. So just coming back to the EU-CELAC context, despite the fact that Latin America and the Caribbean doesn't usually speak with one voice at the UN climate talks, given Brazil is a member of the basic group with India, China, and South Africa. You have the ALBA countries, ILAC countries, Central America, Caribbean, everyone seemingly doing their own thing. The EU-CELAC summit can actually benefit from some recent diplomatic efforts within CELAC, which includes all countries in the region. And this actually comes from a regional effort led by Brazil and Chile, which has been promoting dialogue among CELAC countries to build trust with the goal of identifying common positions for the UN climate talks. And as we just heard, Ecuador's current presidency of CELAC has, I think, been very encouraged by these developments, which it seems like this informal initiative is kind of being pushed up the agenda. So for Europeans looking at the region, I think this progress within CELAC to try and speak with one voice is very encouraging. And if we look at what they're actually saying, I think this is very important, and we can see how European countries can engage with CELAC on the road to Paris. So one thing CELAC is pushing for is a new global deal on climate change should treat adaptation and mitigation in a balanced manner. Some of the figures we saw from David Wilk, you can just see this massive difference between investments in mitigation and adaptation. And we know that climate impacts in Latin America are very, very serious indeed. So adaptation really needs to receive greater priority. As we heard before, CELAC is also committed to the 2-degree Celsius limit on global temperature increases, and it also supports a legally binding agreement. But it's also reminding developed countries that they have a commitment to provide developing countries with 100 billion per year in climate finance by 2020. And we cannot escape the fact that climate finance is going to be a key kind of hinge to determine the success in Paris. So I think Latin American, Caribbean countries can use the upcoming summit in Brussels to reassure the EU that it's a value partner. It can call on Europe to provide greater predictability of financial flows and alignment on climate and development objectives, especially to reduce inequality and poverty, boost clean energy, and build sustainable urban transport and infrastructure, which can complement this INDC design process. So just to clarify, the INDCs, they're the post-2020 climate contributions. So the preparations are going to take a while, but they really need to be kind of planned as robustly and ambitiously now as possible. So following the difficult climate negotiations in Copenhagen, which I think is quite a generous way of framing it, European leaders may be lowering expectations for the Paris talks. They're understandably reluctant to expend too much political capital by calling for a far-reaching deal. But at a time when concern about global warming among citizens in both regions is growing, there is no time to kind of sit back and act indecisively. I'm not including the French presidency in this, but more it's 27 other partners of the EU. European leaders should boldly show that they're committed to an ambitious outcome in Paris and really come behind France and show its support, and that Europe will also enhance its support of CELAC's climate actions. I think CELAC countries need to have more reassurance from Europe that these actions that are taking are being taken seriously, but the rich countries, developed countries, many of them in Europe, really need to show CELAC that it's willing to support its efforts. And if we just take one example, Latin America and the Caribbean, its energy demand is rising very fast. And the Inter-American Development Bank reports that sustained economic growth is driving an increase in the region's energy-related emissions, particularly from power generations and transport. But BID also says that Latin America, and this is an astounding figure, can meet its future energy needs through renewable sources, including solar and wind, which are sufficient to cover its projected 2050 electricity needs 22 times over. So in other words, the potential for renewable energy in Latin America is just astounding. So I think the EU, given its leadership on clean energy, can really play a role in promoting energy cooperation, cooperation on renewable energy in Latin America, and also transferring technology, which is a key part of this. So just to wrap up, coming back to the diplomatic side, EU-LAC countries can make the case that climate protection and economic growth can be complementary, and balanced cooperation is possible between developing countries. And I think we've seen that the positive experience of the Cartagena dialogue should not be forgotten, and in fact, it should be dusted off and expanded. And one example of this, before... Sorry.
Please, can you go to a conclusion?
Yep, just concluding now. Mexico's experience of participating in the Cartagena dialogue as the incoming president of COP16 in 2010 was instrumental in its preparation and running of the COP. So this experience, I think, shows something very positive for the French presidency of COP21 to follow. So, final comment. By forming a high ambition alliance, which could be enlarged to other groups such as the Alliance of Small Island States, the Group of Least Developed Countries, the EU and CELAC heads of state can chart the necessary course to set the world on a path towards a low-carbon, sustainable and resilient future. In Latin America's case especially, the INDCs are of great importance to build momentum not only at the UN climate talks, but also in the attempt to mainstream climate change and development goals. So I think next week at the EU-CELAC summit in Brussels, it's imperative that EU and CELAC heads of state and relevant ministers really participate at that summit to try and achieve that goal. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much. It's good to hear such an optimistic view of the EU-CELAC relationship, which is very important, but I always made many declarations, and it's always difficult to make something concrete after that. So I hope that you are right, and you and CELAC will be able to make a significant contribution for the next COP21.